into it. Welcome everybody to our virtual continuation of our Broker Lawyer Committee meeting. It was a long and extensive meeting that we had on July 12th that we jumped into the compensation issue in addition to our other order of business. And so I'll officially call this meeting to order at 2:05. And really appreciate everybody's patience and input that you've been giving us in terms of the compensation issue. The one thing that's clear is everybody on this committee is trying their best and in earnest to develop the best possible solutions. And today we are doing this meeting virtually so we could continue our discussion. We didn't want to shortchange and develop any recommendations for the commission that were not fully discussed and vetted. We've scheduled this meeting for 2 hours, and while we'll try our best to stay within that and keep this meeting organized, we at the end of the day want to develop this as the best thing that we can. So at the beginning, I'd like to start, as we always do, with general introductions. My name is John George. I'm the co-chair on the attorney side of the Broker Lawyer Committee. And present in the room there, Ron, if you can hear us, you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm here, Ron Walker.
Hey, then if we can go around the members as you can.
Kristen Tatum Jansen, broker member.
Diane McCoy, broker member.
Mary Minor, broker member.
Melissa Haley, broker member.
Darlene Fairchild, public member.
Brian Watts, attorney member.
Leitra, attorney member.
Amy Slusher, attorney member.
I saw we have Lee on here and also Tony. If you might be muted, you can make sure that you're unmuted and on the call.
Yes, let me unmute Lee, and there might be a slight delay before it gives her the ability to turn on her mic and camera.
Okay.
Lee said, can you turn on your camera and unmute? Hers is blocked.
And I see Tony has his hand up as well, so he might be having issues with his audio.
Where is Lee? I don't see Lee yet.
From this end, it appears that all the committee members do have access, or that I have granted access to them. So I think they have to possibly unmute and turn on their cameras on their end.
Yeah, I just tried to unmute Lee and it doesn't work, so.
I did have an issue in the beginning when I was using an external camera and an external microphone. It would not accept that. Just FYI, if that's the problem for anybody that's trying to log in.
Let's see, while we're working through those technical issues, just to move things along, I believe we have some of our commissioners on the call as well. I see Commissioner Renee Harvey-Lowe is present. I am looking through the list here. Fortunately, we have quite a few attendees on here to see if Chairman Kesner, I'm not seeing his name immediately on the list. I do see, go ahead.
Chair Kesner won't be able to join, but he did want me to raise a question that came to him from another broker when the time is right. And
okay,
I think
I'll mark that down.
Commissioner
and I see Commissioner Hartgraves. I'm sorry about that. Commissioner Jason Hartgraves is also on the call today. And as always, we appreciate your support and giving your additional time to attend our committee meetings. And so do we want to go ahead and jump in? What my plan is to give a few opening remarks and then go around the room with the committee members to give a short statement on where they stand and their position, and then we can get into the guts of the discussion that we started with last time. But if it's okay, I think we go ahead and start there to start the meeting, and then we can work through the technical issues as we do that, if that's okay. Okay. So here, no objection. I'll move forward with that. Last meeting we had a very vigorous discussion on potential solutions, and what we came to some agreements, and also put to today some additional discussion on other potential agreements. The one thing I would like to recenter us on, and I don't want to go back through the NAR lawsuit and those issues, but why are we considering changes to these contracts beyond that? The one core thing that we have are practice changes that are happening in our industry. Regardless of the lawsuit, there's a different way that agents are going to be doing business. And one of the biggest concerns here is no longer having an MLS offer of compensation. And so much of our discussion at the last meeting and at this meeting is how to address, if at all, changes to our TREC forms to accommodate the new practice of real estate that will impact not only license holders, but ultimately the consumers, which are our buyers and sellers. Another thing we must address is any other changes that might come about, or at least consider addressing, and that's in terms of the buyer compensation side and the changes that are coming to the industry with that. We're very cognizant of that. We're not Texas Realtors. We're not National Association of Realtors. And Texas Real Estate Commission was not part of the lawsuits. And so what we're trying to do is our statutory directive of keeping things simple and efficient and provide clarity to the consumers and license holders in the practice of real estate. And so we've considered several different options that we've discussed ad nauseum at the last meeting. And we've analyzed whether we want to add language to the contract, whether we want to add an addendum, whether there's these practice changes are coming out. One of the biggest concerns is how is the compensation going to be addressed between consumers and license holders, and what do we need to do to address that? Some of the practice changes that we're seeing now that cooperative compensation is no longer on MLS is the various different contract addendums that are being drafted by attorneys for brokers or by the parties themselves. We're seeing specific offers of compensation on broker websites now as a replacement for what used to be on MLS. Each one of those agreements have varying terms. Before, we used to have somewhat of consistency, at least with the MLS that we had with the NAR TXR members who used it, a very consistent contract for the commission. Now, with it being varied and all the way up to oral contracts. Of course, I think we'd all recommend everything should be in writing, but between brokers, oral contracts are enforceable, and we're seeing oral contract disputes now arise. So we're seeing how we can address that in our forms moving forward. Some of the overriding concerns are, again, protecting the license holders and the consumers. One of the concerns that was put on the table at the last meeting was requiring disclosure or not requiring disclosure of the private contracts between clients and the real estate agents and brokers. A concern was raised that we don't think, there's a suggestion that we should not disclose all the amounts between those private contracts and instead facilitate the transaction by providing disclosure of the terms that are needed to know for the transaction itself. And so the title companies and the consumers know what amounts are being paid. And of course, another concern was making agents parties to the contracts. Right now, all of our contracts are between the consumers, the buyers and sellers themselves. There's one contract that we had, the Farm and Ranch, that has a ratification fee that is not intended to make the brokers parties to the contract. But in the Farm and Ranch, there's a ratification fee that the brokers signed to confirm a prior agreement concerning the commissions. And so today's meeting is going to be a discussion of the very extensive meeting we had on July 12th. And I would like to start this meeting by giving us all on the committee an opportunity to discuss our concerns in a concise manner and to generally have an opening statement. If you will, I would like to leave this to 1 minute per committee member, and we'll have an extensive discussion afterwards. But this gives us an opportunity to set the table and to discuss again where we left off last time. I know last meeting got quite confusing with the number of discussions that were happening, and it was somewhat hard to follow. So I'd like to start off with clear, uninterrupted time for each committee member to discuss their concerns. I'll start with my individual concerns that I know there is no perfect solution. And we've had recommendations from a lot of the consumers and a lot of the license holders on what we should do. And it was across the board. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the comments that we received in writing from the license holders and consumers wanted some action, whether it's in the contract or an addendum. And I think that, our last meeting, to tee it up a little bit more, we decided in a split vote not to put it in the contract, or at least not recommend it in the contract from this meeting. That's on the table for future discussions down the road, but for this meeting, we wanted to move along and are now looking at the addendum. There's a version that Brian Watts was kind enough to draft at the last meeting that we left off discussing. I think I would like to see some action taken on that addendum because I think it's important for the clarity of it. The one thing that I would like to see is more of a disclosure like we have in the 1 to 4 family contract with the language that Brian drafted, but have the agents also ratify at the bottom below the signature lines, just like they do in the farm and ranch. Keep in mind, the farm and ranch goes beyond what we have in this current draft. The farm and ranch has the buyer or seller agreeing to pay the listing broker or the buyer's broker. We don't have that in our current draft. Right now, it's essentially a disclosure which takes into account the changes we did to paragraph 12. And I like that approach at the end, and I think we should continue discussing that and look at maybe adding the ratification. Before I tee it off, I'll go back to say at the last meeting for everybody listening in, we decided to add into the contract, or recommend adding into the contract, an additional language in paragraph 12. And in paragraph 12, we decided to recommend to split out the seller concessions. So there's a blank for seller concessions specifically for buyer agent or buyer broker compensation, and then a separate blank for all other seller concessions. And those are, of course, concessions for buyer's expenses. And so we'll have a very detailed discussion today, and but in no particular order. The next person that appears on my screen is Melissa. So Melissa, if you want to take your minute to give your thoughts or no thoughts at all, and we'll go from there.
Sure. After thinking about it quite a bit more, I think that the bulk of the solution has probably, assuming that it gets approved, has probably found its place in paragraph 12A1B. Because as a real estate practitioner, you've got your agreements with your consumer, right? You're going to have that buyer representation agreement or that listing agreement, and that's your agreement for your compensation. And the listing agent obviously is getting paid by their seller, and that's where that's coming from. But for the buyer's agent, there were opportunities for it to come partly from the buyer, partly from the seller, or partly from cooperative compensation between the two brokers, right? And the change that we made in paragraph 12A1B, if it does in fact get approved and moved forward, that allows the seller to pay a portion of it. And obviously your buyer rep agreement already handles the fact that the buyer can pay a portion of it. And so really the only missing piece there is the cooperative compensation. And I agree that we don't want that to become part of the contract, right? Because this is an agreement between people that aren't parties to the contract. The contract is between the buyer and the seller, and we're talking about money that's being exchanged between a broker and a broker. And so if we were to do something where it was a ratification, maybe after the signature line, after that, executed contract is complete, where maybe we just, for clarity purposes, show what that might look like, I would definitely be okay with that. There was a time a month or two ago where I was like, gosh, I really feel like it needs to be all in an addendum to the contract where we can just spell it all out in one spot. But I feel like we did a really great job of putting all of those concessions in one spot already in paragraph 12. So, you know, I don't necessarily know that I feel we need the addendum. If we decide to go that direction, then obviously I would like to see, as a matter of a disclosure, all of the fees, because the only reason in my mind why we would have an addendum is if we were going to have somewhere where all of the money was on one piece of paper. And that's the only rationale that I would have for why we might need that addendum. So I think I have no other thoughts. I feel like that was clear, but if it's not, John, let me know.
I think that's very clear and understandable. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, next, Amy, you're next on my screen here.
Well, since I did have to leave our last meeting a little early, I did miss the end of the discussion. But I would say that I do like the changes in paragraph 12 of the contract. I do think that addresses a big part of the issue. I'm not, I mean, when we left, I guess at our last meeting, my thoughts were maybe see how the Texas Realtors addendum that they've come up with that would be out, a little bit longer, and kind of see how if that alleviated some people's concerns and see how that was received. And then dealing with the concessions in this paragraph, I think addresses a big part of the issue. So that's sort of the way I was leaning when we left, the last meeting. I'm not necessarily opposed to having an addendum if that is, what the majority of people on the committee wish to do. And so I'm open to it, but I wouldn't say, I really feel like we're addressing a lot of it in the contract with those changes, but open to discussion and looking at an addendum if that is kind of the will of the group. So.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Next up, we have Christy.
Thank you, John. So there was a lot of perspective provided in our last meeting, and I want to keep going back to the reason we exist. One, clarity for the parties that are part of the contract. And while, yes, we do have separate agreements between brokerage and client in regard to compensation, and yes, education and continued communication needs to increase and get better along those lines, I don't believe that there is enough clarity for the consumer in the contract in order for them to get all the information they need. So I love the idea of moving forward with an addendum. I think the steps we went to in making suggested modifications to paragraph 12 is a start. However, I do think the additional clarity, disclosure, similar ratification, I was one of the ones who did not want to take off the table of putting it in the contract, similar to Farm and Ranch. And maybe we can take that up later on down the road. But in the meantime, a disclosure ratification to provide that layer of clarity and transparency to the consumer, not over disclosing what is in private contracts between listing agent and client, or buyer's rep agreement and client, but that added clarity so a buyer knows exactly what's getting paid, a seller's very clear. I don't think that hurts, and I do think the public has spoken and asking us to do something, and I do not think we can ignore that.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Let's see. Next up, we have Darlene.
Muted.
Darlene, you're muted.
I like the changes that we did, but I'll defer probably to the rest of the group because I don't do it every day. I think it addresses most of it, but
what plays out in the future may change what we do. So that's all I got.
Great. Hey, thank you, Darlene. Next, we have, let's see, on my screen, well, going down the side menu here. Brian, you're next on that list.
Well, let me start off with two general observations. The first one is I want to give kudos, bouquets, attaboys to John and Ron for how the last meeting was conducted. It was absolutely confusing. There were tense moments, and I think you guys handled it as true professionals. Having said that, I will confess, like any lawyer, I have an ego, but my goodness, I changed my mind at least 4 times in the middle of the meeting as to what I was thinking would be a good idea. And coming back from the meeting and having a few days to rest and pull my mind together, here are the things that I think. First of all, I love the change in paragraph 12 where we add in a separate line item for concessions that the seller is going to give to the buyer. I think that's going to be super valuable, and it should be in the contract. Second of all, I think we ought to have something, because if the really smart people on this call were confused about what was going on, I just pity the poor consumer who doesn't know what to do, and to give them one piece of paper that sets out what the commissions are going to be. That's going to be beneficial to both the seller and the buyer to provide full disclosure over about a very important element, financial element of the contract. I like, for example, I like the TXR form 2406. I think we could make it simpler along the lines of version 4 addendum we have, where we say the total commissions are this, and then A, B, C, and D. These are what are going to be paid. That's going to be signed by the seller and the buyer. It is optional to have a ratification of the agents at the bottom. Probably a good idea, but not essential. The version 4 did have a couple representations and authorizations, just generic, that we had thrown in. And I think those are good, and those probably need to go into paragraph 8 of the contract. I can't remember, I think it was Melissa said, there's value in putting all of the money on one piece of paper so that everybody can understand. And having a document that is easy for the uneducated consumer to understand, I think is going to be exceedingly valuable especially in light of the fact with the NAR settlement, we don't know what's going to be happening and where the market's going to go. And to have one document that provides the clarity, there's real value in that.
Thank you, Brian, and I appreciate the kind words on the last meeting. The next on my list here is Tony. Did Tony's technical issue?
I think I got it working. Can you hear me?
You can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. No, I echo Brian's sentiments on that, John. You had very good temperament in our last meeting, and we appreciate you kind of leading the charge with such patience. No, I was not. Brian said he changed his mind 4 or 5 times. I was probably changed it twice. I don't think we should, we haven't done anything or worried about this in the years that I've been on this. And so I really wasn't for making any change. I was really let's let Texas Realtors and their settlement work itself out. And I can see, John, you're correct that in the foreseeable future, we're not likely to glean any insight in the next couple of years based on how the litigation goes and what happens. So we probably need to make a move if we're going to make it now. There's no reason to wait. So I agree with that. I thought we made some great changes to the paragraph 12. That's when my mind started changing a little bit. I thought we did good work there. And with Christy's sentiment, it can't hurt if really all we're supposed to do is disclosures, but it can't hurt if we want to have one sheet of paper that lets that consumer know this is what buyer's paying, this is what seller's paying, this is the commissions. Maybe not the details between the buyer and their own broker and the seller and their own broker, but enough to know how the money's going back and forth. I mean, I just don't see how that can hurt anything. We have a kind of a succinct addendum. These people are getting this money, these people are getting this money, so everybody's on the same page. Whether we get it ratified, I'm almost afraid if you don't require ratification of the brokers, they're not going to bother to even get it done. I think the brokers want it done as much as anybody, so they got that extra belts and suspenders to know when it goes to the title company how everybody's getting compensated. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate those kind words as well. And I really appreciate all these clear comments. And I think it highlights the discussion from the last meeting and really sets the table well. The next one we have on the list, SJ will be joining us shortly, so we'll give her an opportunity to talk. Lee, you're I believe last on our list. Excuse me.
Yeah, so I agree that we did good work in paragraph 12. And assuming that that is approved, I don't think we need anything else. I don't think we need an addendum. If we do have an addendum, I don't think we need something that the brokers are going to sign. Or if we put it, after the signature lines on the contract for the brokers to sign, because I think that opens up more problems than we have right now. I think what happens if the broker won't sign? Right? I mean, there's so many questions that come with that. I also wonder if we're doing written buyer broker agreements and written seller agreements, how does a consumer get to the point where they're executing a contract and not knowing? Having done it so many times and recognizing that not everyone does it the same way. I don't know how they get that far without knowing about that money. So I'm not really in favor of the addendum, but I do like paragraph 12, and I would chime in and say we had a great, very productive meeting. And a lot of that is, and thanks to John and Ron for doing such a great job. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate that as well. And Ron, the best for last. Ron, no knock against everybody else, but Ron naturally rises to the top of the table here. Ron, if you want.
Ron, if Ron's going to be last, you forgot me.
And me.
Oh man, who else did I forget?
Mary and Diane.
I am sorry, my checkbox. I messed up my checkbox with who was here with who gave a statement. So I apologize.
And later.
For that. No.
I'm just saying, if Ron's going to be last, that's a good choice.
All right, so we'll go Mary, Latra, then Ron. How about
What
that?
about Diane? Are you not seeing me?
Diane.
And Diane,
Okay, sorry.
I need to go back to my own checklist. Part of it's my screen showing up here only shows some of you, not everybody. And then I use my other checklist for who came in, was at the meeting. So please accept my apologies on that. And so we'll go Mary, Latra, and then Diane, and Ron, you can cap us off at the end.
Again, I want to thank everybody for a great meeting on Friday. It went by fast, but there was a lot of discussion, and I was like with a lot of people, switched my opinion more than once during the conversation. And coming back and looking at it, I really believe what we have made the changes in 12 is the right thing to do. I don't foresee an amendment. I think Texas Realtors has paperwork there for compensation and broker to broker and all that fun stuff, because I do agree with Lee, a broker should not have to sign when it's in a contract, because this is between a buyer and a seller. It does not, I don't want to be party of a contract. And I don't think anyone that is in real estate wants to be party of the contract. because it's also, since we've met, you know, people are saying, well, do we have to show buyer rep agreements in? Do we have to show listing agreements? And then we're going into the whole private issue of, no, you don't have to show any of that paperwork. So I agree with what we've made as a change, and I don't agree with an addendum, but I'll be open to listening because that's what happened on Friday. But thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Latra, sorry.
Oh, you're muted.
There you go. Okay. So I think it sounds like we're still a little bit split, and the change in paragraph 12 is something that's very helpful. You know, if our goal is clarity and full disclosure for all the parties, we got to put something in there. I don't know that 12 alone is enough, because there are other situations where compensation is going to need to be collected and paid through the title side. And I think an addendum is important and necessary, but I also don't think that agents or brokers need to participate in execution of it, because from a practical standpoint, that just adds an extra layer to getting the contract executed by all parties. But enough to put it in there so that it's eliminating all of the potential questions that might be coming out there. There are some situations where disclosure of the payment on behalf of the buyer may also have a lender context issue. And so to have it all in the contract that everybody gets disclosure of up front, I think is going to be really helpful. It'll minimize a lot of the discussion and the arguments that we run into.
Right. I appreciate that. Next up, we have Diane.
Thank you, John. Like everyone, I went back and forth, and I think I've kind of come back to where I was in January when we first started talking about this, and going along with the majority of those from our public responses that we went over on what the practitioner really feels is necessary. I am concerned because over the last couple of weeks, training on the Texas Realtors Addendum, the confusion that's out there among those who are using it. I think we're going to see some changes. One indication of that was a meeting that was called on Friday for Texas Realtors. They're raising a lot of questions from the membership on its usage. I would hate to see us come up with an addendum that is only going to have to be changed. Agents are very confused about what is in the addendum. It misses unrepresented buyers and intermediary. So if we try to do that too, I fear we're going to have to change it. I think we did a good job in 12A. I agree with that. I've talked to some lenders that wonder if the agencies involved, being HUD and FHA, are going to be okay with that. But at least we've made a place for funds to be referenced. I would like to see what we have in Farm and Ranch at the bottom of the contract. Very simple, buyer seller who pays them. We passed that contract to move forward as is. I've wanted to see that in the contract, all of the contracts, to keep it simple. If there's anything that's added later, we can always do an addendum later, but I am not in favor of an addendum right now, just based on what I have seen over the last couple of weeks, trying to have agents utilize the existing addendum. I think they're going to see that change. So bottom line, I would just like to see us have 12A stay as it is and have the information about who pays who as Farm and Ranch just duplicated in all of our contracts. I think that's our only duty at this point.
All right, thank you, Diane. And Ron, I believe now we've come to you. I did that a little prematurely earlier.
Right. Well, I want to thank everybody for their participation and very collegial attitude at the last meeting. So I think we made good work. Like with most everyone else, I agree that the changes in paragraph 12 were good. I did hear some anecdotal comments from some mortgage brokers that I can share later on paragraph 12. But I think it's a good, easy solution. If we did not do an addendum, I think it's fine. We just educate members on how to work with paragraph 12 and produce the necessary documentation to the title companies for proper disbursement. I also think that the doing an addendum is probably a good thing for now. I have no doubt that we will need to change the addendum once all of this settles out, maybe in a year or however long it'll take, because whatever we do today is we don't have enough experience with this situation yet. But I think it's good work, and I think we should proceed in moving forward in consideration of the addendum, but pat a little bit of ourselves on the back with related to paragraph 12.
All right. Thank you, Ron. And I would also like to give the opportunity to our commissioners, if they would like to at this point, to make a comment. And of course, as always, feel free to jump in the conversation today. But would any one of our commissioners like to comment at this point?
I'll mention on behalf of the chair, who just texted me and said that he had received a comment from somebody in his world, a residential broker, who had the question of why the change in paragraph 12 couldn't include a percentage. Right now it has a specific dollar amount. And Abby and I remembered that y'all had that discussion. Wondered if kind of in the midst of this conversation, you might remind us or consider that.
And Brian, I see your hand went up first.
As I recall, we did think about that, because that if there's an amendment to the sales price, having a percentage can make things easier. But as I recall, we also talked about amending changing the amendment form to provide flexibility by being able to change that number in the amendment form. And I think that's how our group dealt with that possibility.
Okay.
That's the best of my recollection on that particular point. And having the price change and then the other calculations change, there might be additional blanks that we could insert into the contract. I know we talked through it, but I would have to go back to the recording to see the exact reasons. But I know we considered that and ultimately arrived at just putting the dollar blank for now in that section. And I guess to move this forward, there is right now not a consensus on whether we actually need the addendum or not. So putting aside whether we ultimately want an addendum at the end or would suggest an addendum, I would like to go through the core issues of what, if we did have an addendum, what would be addressed in there. And instead of looking at it holistically, maybe if we parse it apart or take it apart by issue. And there's a few issues that I see in there, and feel free to add the others. But one of the big ones is the disclosure of fees, and another one be whether it's ratification by the agents, and then the third one would be what representations or authorizations do we need to give to the parties. And so not being that being the entire list, but to jump right into one of the first, and I think one of the bigger ones, is the disclosure of fees. There's on one end of the spectrum, we could lay out somewhat like I saw Ron sent me earlier today an addendum that was published by, I believe, the Austin MLS, the Austin, was it Unlocked MLS? I believe this is from Austin, that had complete disclosure in one of our drafts or one of our discussion last meeting, complete disclosure of all the fees. The seller is going to pay this exact fee to these exact people. The buyer is going to pay these exact fees to these exact figures or people. The concern that was pretty loud at the last meeting, and I think agreed to by most, I'd like to start with, is the looking at whether we go from that side of the spectrum of complete disclosure, which gets into privacy concerns, to the other side of the disclosure that what we have right now in the contract, which is just how much the listing broker is paying the other broker, which is most of the time the buyer's broker. Just for our discussion, the other broker in our contracts right now includes a sub-agent of the listing broker, which would represent the seller. So we have to be careful in our terminology here and look at clarity purposes, maybe changing that in our language. But so the concern that was voiced with complete disclosure is privacy, and also disclosing what some agents or brokers consider their confidential business practices that they only want their clients to know. If we had a form that had a complete disclosure of this is exactly how much is being paid, not only to the other side, but it's being paid to me, then all the agents who use the forms will be necessarily disclosing their business relationships with their clients. And I know that's a very large concern that's been expressed, and that both will impact, and I think have one of the concerns with the litigation out there outside NAR is having brokers talk about commissions and amounts being charged and reaching a consensus on here's our levels. I think having a complete disclosure like that allows other brokers to see exactly what's being charged and may not go to the whole purpose and intent behind pursuing these lawsuits to begin with. But it's something to consider. So maybe if we look at the disclosure of fees first, what do we think is necessary? I'll start with my opinion is I do like the disclosure of what is being paid across lines, meaning what is being paid from the listing broker to the buyer's broker. And I think that's important for clarity, for the contracts, for the parties to know, for the title company to know. And it's a really big deal point. I don't think we need to go all the way to say the listing broker needs to say how much they're charging in total to their client. That gets into their business practice. That's somewhat of a concern that if we put it out there, then as a business owner, separately from being a real estate broker, would concern me if I have to disclose my private contract terms to the other side. We don't require, and I don't think there's any appetite to require right now, the disclosure of listing agreements, disclosure of buyer rep agreements. And by putting that into a form, I think we cross that line, not necessarily require those agreements, but require disclosure of the amounts in those agreements. So I would first tee that issue up for discussion to see if anybody has any contrary thoughts or wants to add to that discussion. And if we can maybe do by raising hands, I see Brian's up, and then I'll call as I see the hands go up. So Brian, if you want to take that and run with it.
Well, first of all, keep in mind the addendums that we've been disclosing or we've been considering. You don't have to use those addendums if it's that important to the brokers that they don't want to have that. They don't have to use the addendum, and they can address it in other ways. Second of all, we've been talking about version 4 as one of the options, and in version 4. On the listing side, we did not disclose what the commission would be, and then with the payment to the buyer broker, that's where everything gets a little difficult, and where the disclosure is important. As you said, we're crossing the lines a bit, and in that instance, we have two different options. One is where it is not disclosed, where the buyer will pay pursuant to separate written agreement, so that there's no need to disclose anything. But if the seller or the listing broker are going to be paying some of it, then then that's a situation where we need to have some disclosure. After all, this all of the money is going to be coming from the seller and the buyer. It's going to be from either the sales price that the seller's paying or additional money that the buyer has to be bringing to the table. And so the right of privacy, in my opinion, steps aside when the seller and the buyer are going to have real financial obligations to be able to get their deal closed. But if you don't want it, if you want to keep everything secret, by doing this optional addendum, you're not preventing people from exercising from keeping things private.
And from what I heard, I believe we were on the same page there, and I'm looking at the addendum itself that we drafted. And Ron, I don't know if you can share your screen just so we have the language there. What Ron did after the last meeting was update with I believe is version 4 that now is turned into version 5. with that language. And the disclosure that's there that Brian just described is similar to the disclosure that's already in our contracts. It's not an enforceable agreement, and we added that it's an informational item only, but our contracts outside the farm and ranch disclosed that fee already that the listing agents agreed to pay the other broker. And so that privacy concern is mitigated, and we haven't had pushback on that in the many years that's been in the agreement.
Hey, quite the opposite, John. If you remember, about a year or two ago, we tried to take it out, and there was great objection in the realtor community.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the language we came up with at the last meeting. So Brian, this is the same as version 4, just with this modification based that you'll see that were in the minutes as I recorded them. So that's all I did was drop this language into B.
So as we're discussing this disclosure issue, what we came up with this addendum that's on the screen for everybody's benefit was we essentially took the disclosure that's already in the contract, which is now, as you see on your screen, B2, and we added whether it's a percentage or a dollar amount, and then language that the buyer shall pay any remaining amount outside of that agreement. We also added the concession language to incorporate the changes that we made to paragraph 12, and that you'll see on your screen in B1. And so to stick with the disclosure issue, I believe Brian and I are on the same page. Would anybody else on the committee like to comment on that, or do you have the same general? By no comment, I believe you have the same general feelings on that particular issue. Again, this is not whether we have an addendum or not, but just on the disclosure of fees. Okay, so we have one. Melissa, your hand up. Or no, is that? Let's see. I'm sorry, I have to make my gallery bigger here.
That's okay. I was just going to say, if we do decide to move forward with an addendum, I would definitely advocate for listing broker fees to be split up like they are here, where we don't specify what they are, because like was mentioned, this is an agreement between the broker and their consumer, and that's confidential information. And I do agree that, we've already covered the other segment. So the listing agent is paying them, paying their listing agent. That the other broker's fees, I like your discussion about maybe changing the wording about how we talk about other brokers versus buyer's broker. But I like the idea that we've already covered. Okay, so buyer's agent can be paid by the seller, right? Because we've got it in 12A1B. And then otherwise the listing broker can share in that compensation, that cooperative compensation. But I would think that maybe buyer shall pay any remaining unpaid amount might be a separate bullet point. So it's a little bit more stand out, because there's these 3 ways to be paid. So that sentence at the bottom of B2 on the screen, maybe, I don't know if that becomes B3 or not, but I think that there needs to be a little bit of separation there. But otherwise, I believe that this would accomplish what we're discussing, which is putting it all in one place, being very clear and transparent who's paying for what, and putting it all on one page.
If you don't mind, and I apologize as I was breaking out my screen to be able to see everybody, what was the distinction you would like to see broken out in B2 to be a separate
He just
item?
did it underneath B2. He put a space in between B2 and then that last sentence in paragraph B that says buyer shall pay any remaining unpaid amount. I think that just needs to be separated, because it was butted up against to the part where the listing broker was going to pay an amount. And I think this is a third person, so it needs to be like a separate paragraph.
Perfect. Okay, let's see. I see Mary's hand up.
The only challenge I have about this on an amendment is what we put in 12, paragraph 12 has an amount, or like what Commissioner Kestner said, can it be a percentage, whatever. Don't we believe B2 then is back to the same thing? Because I would assume the concession, the seller agreed to pay the broker fees payable in 12A, the same number if I communicated with the other agent, and then 2 is saying the listing broker is gonna give us more. I mean, I'm a little confused about 1 and 2.
Yes, and so the distinction there is the B1 is the amount that is coming straight from the seller to the buyer's agent. The number 2 is the amount that's coming from the broker to the buyer's agent.
Okay.
And so there's a line there that the seller may not agree to pay the entire commission amount, and there may already be some amount offered that the seller is paying to their own agent that the agent is giving up.
Okay,
And so I think they're 2 totally different concepts, but they may need more clarity in being split out or discussed.
Okay, so if in the listing agreement, the seller says, do not share. Okay, we have that statement, do not share. Okay, so there isn't going to be any, so I'm just asking that question because I would assume if they're going to share, they're going to be talking to us and we're going to see what the brokerage fees are going to be. If they say do not share, I don't care if I can share or not. If I'm willing to share, if the seller has told me not to share, I can't share. That's why I'm asking. I mean, it's either they're going to give money or they're not going to give money. And that's what my challenge is.
John,
And that's, oh, go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to maybe outline sort of a couple of questions that may have come up with how this plays out. So when you're talking about the buyer broker's fees here, you may or may not know the total amount of the fee based on what's been done here. So for example, if you say that you know that the buyer broker's fee is going to be $10,000 and there's a $2,000 concession that's in paragraph 12A1B, then you know that 2,000 is going to be here. If the listing broker says, I'm not going to pay anything, then the buyer broker has to pay the buyer has to pay the remaining amount. That's how that would work. So you can run through the various scenarios in that way. So this does not disclose, only discloses, doesn't necessarily disclose the full amount of the buyer broker commission. Now, if the buyer broker doesn't want the buyer to pay anything, then obviously he's going to try to make sure that 1 and 2 add up to the full amount of his fee. That's what he's going to be working for. But that's going to be an individual transaction.
And Ron, I understand that, but and I know we're not in a lawsuit or anything, but the DOJ has said do not do any workarounds. And I really think this is opening up workarounds because they basically said when they've asked everything to be taken off of the MLS, they don't want any workarounds. And I just think this is opening, that's my opinion, opening up to workarounds. If all of a sudden number 1 and number 2 match exactly what compensation is, that's a workaround. And I think it's going to be said and done and we're going to be Xing it out. But
and to keep on the disclosure issue, we're going to have, I guess that is directly on point there on the workaround issue coming up. And that's a part of the disclosures, business practices, concerns about workarounds. At the same time, balancing it, one thing that I've always been a big proponent of is freedom of contract and the free and open negotiation of transactions to meet what the parties desired and what they intend. And so, but that is a concern, Mary, and I appreciate you bringing that up, and it's something that we need to be cognizant of. We're not parties as TREC or this committee to the lawsuits, but it is a concern that's out there in litigation. Lee, I see your hand up, and Diane, I see your hand up after that.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with the point of the addendum. I just don't see that it does anything that hasn't already been done. And as y'all were talking, I was thinking maybe it was just about, a clearer instruction to the title company than what they get presently. But it really doesn't seem to do that either. Also, I think in the last meeting, we discussed the use of the word concession. When we made those changes to 12, we specifically did not use that word. So I think that we need to use different wording here. When I look at this, I still struggle with intermediary. Because if you're going to tell them in this situation, why would you not tell them whatever in intermediary? And if we do that, it should be called intermediary because they're not the listing broker and they're not the buyer broker, they're the intermediary. So I don't think we've addressed that. And then I would ask if Ron could scroll down just so I can see if there's something there that I'm missing.
And I think intermediary is a whole separate bullet point concern. And stepping back from the need for the addendum to begin with, because after this discussion of the issues, we may arrive that we don't need the addendum at all. In this discussion, I'm hoping to get out the concerns on the discrete issues underneath it. And I would like to have the intermediary discussion as well as its own subpoint. And part of the need for the addendum may roll down to whether it's ratified or not to incorporate what I would like as the next one, a ratification, that particular issue. So continuing on with the disclosure of fees issue, and Diana, I believe your hand was up next.
Yes, and to the word concession, I think we talked about using the word contribution instead of concession. And I worry too that there are issues unknown as a result of a lawsuit that are going to be affecting what can and cannot be said and done. Again, the reason why I think we need to be simple in the contract. If we need to include who pays what, if we look at what is on page 10 of the Farm and Ranch contract and the simplicity of that line to acknowledge just that, I think we need to have time to see what shakes out with the Texas Realtors Addendum as it affects the license holders in their transactions. I think it's premature to do an addendum. I totally agree with Lee. The intermediary issue is not addressed. Other broker is not in existence when it is an intermediary situation. I think just our own doubts and concerns and the concern about doubly paying things if agents aren't careful what's in 12A and what is on an addendum. I think we're premature. I think we need to see how the next couple of months work. We want the new contracts to go forward. And if all we need to do is to keep it 12A in there and indicate buyer and seller are paying buyer agent, listing agent, whatever the case may be, again, mirroring Farm and Ranch, which has worked for ages. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I do think we need to be simple and clear. And I'm still not seeing, look at our conversation right now. It took hours in the morning in our in-person meeting, and then we picked it up again, and now here we are again, and we don't have a consensus because we're confused on what is the simplest and clearest way for the consumer and for the agent. And I don't think we've got there yet.
Thank you, Diane. I see Melissa, you have your hand up next.
I also had another thought about listing broker to pay whatever, a percentage or a dollar amount here. I believe in another addendum that is doing something similar to this, that might come from the association. It says something like, as agreed to in a separate agreement. And I think that we would want to be really clear, is this, who's signing this document, and is it just a disclosure, and is there another separate written agreement between the brokers to share in any compensation? And I'm not sure that that's clear here either. So I don't know what the resolution is, if we would want to put something in there, because we don't provide a form for an agreement between brokers for sales compensation. So I just think that we need to be sure that we're sending the right message with the form. Does this create an obligation for the listing broker to pay the other person, or was that already handled somewhere else and we're just disclosing it? It just needs to be clear.
That's the perfect segue to my next kind of topical concern is ratification of this document. I think beyond disclosure, the next thing comes to whether this is an enforceable agreement as to the agents. What we have in the farm and ranch right now are two different commission sections. The first commission section is a ratification of fee. It's the only time that agents sign a portion of the contract anywhere, and it's to ratify a fee that was previously agreed to. And the history behind that, there's a couple of different reasons that arose, and it's been in there a long time, but one of them is that the farm and ranch properties, by and large, weren't marketed in the MLS system. And so there was no contract for fees that was clear between the listing broker and the buyer's broker. So the ratification of fee, one of the issues that solved was to say, here's how much was offered. That may or may not have been discussed in a written contract. It could have been oral. And in fact, a lot of farm and ranch properties are done on handshakes. And here's how much of a commission I'm offering to the other side. And this provided them an opportunity of where to list that amount. And so we're facing somewhat, in my view, of a similar situation now with residential. We don't know what the tools will be to solve it in the long run. It might be all on the broker's websites. It might be via third-party websites. It might be in addendum that are signed, the registration agreements outside the contract that are signed, that are offered. A lot of those forms are only available. Again, not all of our license holders are members of NAR and have direct access to those forms. That doesn't prevent them from drafting their own through their own counsel or drafting them for their own behalf. So I think one important aspect to this is to look at the ratification as a limited method of having the broker sign to confirm the actual commission agreement. I've seen many cases in my practice where there's been a dispute over what that agreement might have been when there's not a written contract. There absolutely should be one, but in a lot of transactions, there's not. And so when you do not have a written agreement, the best way that I think to protect the consumer is to have a short statement like we have in the farm and ranch to confirm what the agreement is. It will prevent last minute closing issues. It will disclose to the sides what one side is paying across the transaction, not to their own client, but across the transaction, and provide clarity. At the same time, I'm nervous about bleeding into the area about making brokers parties to the contract. But we haven't seen that issue raise itself in farm and ranch. That provision's been in there a long time. And if it's formatted properly, if it's below the signature lines, if it's broken out, I think it's something we should consider to put in this addendum to make that enforceable at the end of the day, to ratify the fee, but to make it clear in whether it's adding additional language that the agents and brokers are not parties to the contract to mitigate against that. And I love this tool on this meeting, so I can see who raised their hand first, actually. So we'll avoid that issue. Lee, your hand was up first.
Yeah, I do think that what's in Farm and Ranch has worked well for them for a long time. But I also feel like they have a completely different background than our residential brokers. And the residential brokers have been trained, as long as I've been in the business, we were always taught if it wasn't someone that's a member of your MLS, you have to have a written agreement. And now they're being trained, you've got to get that written agreement. So I think if we have something like is in the Farm and Ranch, we just encourage them not to get the written agreement because they've got this fail-safe in the contract. Mm-hmm. And I really don't want to assume the worst of them, right? If we're training them to do something, then I want to expect them to do it. So that is my concern.
And to finish out that comment, and if you can add additional thought on, I know the vast majority of license holders are realtors, meaning they're members of NAR, National Association of Realtors and Texas Association of Realtors. But for those that are not, there's not a readily available form to do that. Does that weigh into the concern at all for you?
Well,
I know
no,
weighs
because the
in, but to the
people, the
extent, how would
people
you
who
address that?
don't have access to a form have never had access to a form, and they've always needed to do this, and they've managed thus far. Right, so they
Except for
either
the fact
already
that it's an
have a
MLS,
form.
right? This
No,
is via the
no, I'm
MLS
saying they
contract, which
weren't
is
using
clear, right?
MLS,
Oh, that's
right?
true. That's true.
They weren't using MLS. They didn't, they were doing something. They were doing some kind of an agreement to ensure that they were getting paid. And if they weren't using the farm and ranch contract, if they are in residential sales, then they were doing something in writing.
Very good point. Tony, or actually, Diane, you're up. You're up next.
And thank you for bringing that up, that section from the farm and ranch. I agree with the signing of the ratification. And I think just the notice to all parties in the title company of who is paying who what is the intent of that, what we're looking at right now. But my question to the attorney members, if we're getting into so much conversation about broker compensation, are we can it be perceived by the public or TREC that we are putting the interests of the agents above that of the consumer? And are we risking a transaction having issues because of this compensation aspect? Just a thought. What is your input on that?
So to tee this up next for Tony, I think the discussion at the last meeting was providing clarity and preventing disputes that will ultimately impact the consumer, the buyer or seller. And in situations where you have oral contracts or people back out of the deals that they may have made, the ethics rules, obviously, and the canons of ethics you shouldn't put your interest first to delay a closing to impact the consumer. But I think all the attorneys on this meeting have seen that happen before, and at least cause a lot of angst and worry at the end on transactions. And by the counter argument to lead the ratification is it solidifies what the agreement is right there in the middle of the document, and not making them parties, but they're agreeing this is what we agreed to outside of the transaction to share, whether it's via MLS or some other written agreement or potentially an oral agreement. So I think the counter to creating more confusion is, well, we're trying to, and just protecting license holders, is we're trying to protect the public by putting all the information out there and reducing potential controversy at the end. Is I think some of the reasons we discussed. And Tony, if you want to take that and others and run with it. Oh, you're on mute still.
I'm going to echo Lee and Diane on that. I'm almost afraid that, respectfully disagree with you, John, that it may not solidify everything with the ratification. It might be, now that you're asking the brokers, and albeit an optional addendum, to sign and ratify, you're necessitating these extra signatures that are putting their fee split at issue on your property sale deal. And so you're requiring, all right, now I'm buying this property, I'm not even thinking about it, but for some reason, brokerage A and brokerage B don't want to sign off, or my deal is not getting to closing good because I'm waiting on one more DocuSign signature because the broker or agent for brokerage A can't get done, which is going to blow up my deal. I feel like we're drawing in more problems by necessitating a signature, albeit again optional addendum. We're drawing in problems to get these brokers to sign off. And while I get, and I know you haven't said it, but I get from the title company perspective, it makes y'all's life a whole lot easier to have a nice one packaged up document that ratifies the fees, and y'all can put those HUDs together and make life beautiful and just pay it out. But it's really not the consumer problem how these two people split. Tell us what the deal is, and y'all got to go make your arrangement. Like farm and ranch you were talking about. I do farm and ranch brokerage as well, in addition to my law practice. And I called someone before this meeting in the car and said, look, we want to look at this West Texas ranch. What kind of split are you offering? And are you willing to put that? I got a form. And he's like, no, I got one. I'm like, for a prospective buyer. I'm like, okay, send it over, identify them, we'll write it out. we just have a different background. And I realize there's less of us than members of NAR, but I'm afraid you're inviting problems with a signature on the ratification.
And next, on that, I would throw in the concern with the new buyer, the requirement for at least Texas Realtor members to have a buyer's rep agreement, which most of those buyer rep agreements will have the buyer agreeing to pay the full amount if it's not paid by the seller. And so there's a dispute there. The new practice, by and large, is going to be having these agreements in place, which are already contractually obligating the buyer to pay some amount that the seller can't get, or the buyer's agent can't get from the seller or the listing agent. So there might be some new controversy added by that to take into account. Let's see, Christy, I believe your hand's up. I see one hand that's up that's not Christy or Brian, but I can't see who
Ron.
it is as number one. Ron? Okay, go ahead, Ron. Ron, if you want.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought maybe you had me jump ahead. I just wanted to point out, just for clarity, so that we're talking about the same issues, because you brought up the issue of ratification, which is struck from form, which we did strike the ratification issue, which is the agreement between brokers. Whereas down here, the seller and buyer are actually agreeing here to pay. And so this is different here because this is an agreement only between seller and buyer and not the brokers here. So, and there's a statement here, of course, I think it was that if you were, we took it out, or did we say, so this is a separate agreement for the payment of brokers' fees. So I think we're going to have some sort of an issue related to how the practice normally works if we're just going to simply drop that into the residential forms, because we are going to normally have outside agreements. And I think the mandate from the settlement agreement is to have buyer rep agreements and listing agreements signed up. But this here says do not sign if there's a separate agreement for the payment of brokers' fees. So I just want to throw those in there for consideration, as opposed to just dropping and doing the same thing that we do in Farm and Ranch into all the other forms. I think they're set up differently. Oops, sorry about that. My finger's a little fast here. That was it.
Okay, thank you, Ron. And trying to focus on the ratification issue and the signing. Let's see, we have next, Christy, you're up next.
Thank you, John. So this is great conversation, and I'm torn on the broker signing. And yes, we should have all of those written agreements. We've done that for years. Where my concern comes in is, even though for years we've done buyer reps, or I know for us, we've done buyer reps and we've had the listing agreements, and I don't want to believe the worst of agents. At the same time, that's exactly why we're where we are, is because agents never explain and communicated properly. And I can hope through amazing education that those conversations will elevate between brokerage, agent, and consumer. However, this is where I'm so torn on the need, and where I see this isn't trying to get into where we're trying to get people in trouble and focus on commission. My focus and what I see with the disclosure of compensation is clarity to the consumer, where when a buyer looks at that, the buyer sees, okay, clearly right here, this is how much the listing broker is paying towards my agent's fees. This is how much the seller is paying towards my contributions from paragraph 12. And that is where I'm so torn, and I appreciate everyone's points of view, but I still think, where does the consumer fall? Because yes, there are some great conversations that are being had out there, but there's a lot of conversations that have become far from elevated to help the consumer understand clearly where they are as far as the compensation and where they're left when it comes to what they need to bring to the table.
Thank you, Christy. And one thing that comes to mind as I tee that to Brian next is the disclosure that we have in our contracts right now. It's informational only. And so on this ratification issue in the back of our minds, let's think about if we leave that disclosure in there, if that gives the concern that Christy had and raised here, which I share, of the buyer knowing exactly what their economics will be and having some written disclosure of the amount that's being paid by the listing side. That's not a seller concession or the term that we end up using, compensation, from there. So whether it's ratified or not, those are options we can discuss at the end. And Brian, you had your hand up next.
If I have any lesson I've learned in my time on the committee and in working on transactions, is that I am never going to rely on the magic wand of education to solve all ills. And to the extent we can make things clear and simple so that everyone understands and everyone gets on the same page, there's value to that. Whenever you're looking at a contract, keep in mind that everyone comes in with their own perspective on things. A litigation lawyer might look at it as, well, can I enforce this in court? And who can I find liable? That might be a purpose of a contract. If I'm an agent, I might want to be able to reach consensus and have a structure by which it's easier for us to get to yes and sign up a contract. And that's one of the big benefits of the TREC contract forms, is it provides guidelines by which people operate. They know what's in the contracts, and they know if they fill in the contract, they'll be able to follow a certain paradigm by which agreement can be reached. There's value in the structure. And another way that there is value to a contract is it will illuminate any differences that may exist at the time of formation of the contract. I'd much rather know if there is a disagreement or a misunderstanding as to who's going to be paying what at the time the contract is being signed, as opposed to the closing table. And I can let the other title people here disagree with me, but if I am at the closing table and the seller, buyer, and brokers are not all on the same page as to what is going to be paid by whom, there's not going to be a closing. Okay? Not going to be a closing. And so I'd much rather find out. And that's one of the values of a contract and a ratification, is to illuminate consensus and illuminate any disagreement at the front end of the deal at the time the contract is formed. That's why I think that it doesn't have to be mandatory, but we're going to create a vehicle by which people can get to yes. And a ratification is something that can do that. And there's intrinsic value, even though may not be concerned about enforcing something in court. There's value in providing a vehicle by which people can get to yes, reach agreement, and everyone's on the same page.
Very good words there, and I agree with those sentiments. Next, we have up Amy.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for making me flip-flop again. So here is, since we've all talked about how we've gone round and round and back and forth, my initial thought had been, well, if we're going to have, and this is just me being the contract drafter, right? If I'm doing something for my client, I would have said this. If we're going to have a statement that says the listing broker is going to pay a portion to the other broker, and we don't have that listing broker sign, then, like, what's the point? But I also feel like, because this issue is so, just uncertain, I guess, because we are in the midst of trying to predict how things are going to go and so forth and so on. I was kind of swaying back to, I think maybe I'd rather just have what we have in this addendum, if we choose to do it, have the information there for purposes of disclosure and making sure that the parties to the contract know how much they're contributing to the compensation here and just leave it at that and and not have the ratification. My thought being, again, and just to kind of reiterate some of the things I know that have been discussed before, are we really trying to solve this whole problem that we don't even know for sure what all the problems are going to be yet? Or are we trying to address concerns to get something out there that can be started to be used? And like Ron said, I think at the very get-go, we're probably, if we do decide to do this, we'll probably end up changing it again, in a year or so after we see how it goes. But I mean, I think my inclination on the ratification issue, just to try to keep it focused on that, since I know that's what John's trying to do. Seriously, I feel very wishy-washy because I've literally thought the opposite thing during this whole meeting. But I just think for simplicity and to try to avoid some of the concerns that have been expressed by some of our brokers about maybe not wanting to sign or not wanting to have to go through the extra gyrations of having more people sign when you're trying to get a contract put together, just the practical aspects of it. I think I'm still kind of thinking along the lines of, if we do the addendum, let's have it there as a disclosure and that be the primary purpose of it, and maybe not have the ratification at this point.
Thank you, Amy. And let's see, up next we have Melissa, and then to Mary.
Can we just get some historical clarification real quick on why we're removing the ratification from the farm and ranch contract? Because if we had it and we didn't think it was a great idea, so we decided to take it out, I'm wondering why we're thinking about putting another one back in somewhere else. And so I think for all the folks that are part of the committee, but also everyone who's maybe listening in or watching in or whatever that might look like, I think having some historical background would be really great on why did we think it was a good idea to remove the ratification from farm and ranch.
I didn't
Ron,
know that
I'm
we
hoping
did.
you can bail me out on this one. I don't recall whether that was tied. Well, with what Brian just said, I'm not sure we actually did. I need to look back at the minutes there. I would think that decision would have been made probably in the context of looking at the addendum or some other form that would have accomplished the same purpose. Mm-hmm. And so I don't recall that being a firm we're taking that out as more of it was part of the discussion. And I was a little surprised when it came up on the screen of having been taken out. But I had not rewatched the 7-hour meeting from last time, but fortunately it's recorded so we can see that. But does anybody else have a better recollection of that portion of it?
I think it was not at the last meeting. I think it had to have been at the meeting before, or maybe 2 meetings before. It wasn't this last meeting.
I agree.
I think it might be in the April meeting minutes, but yes, it's in the April meeting minutes from our April meeting.
So we had previously taken out the little disclosure below in all the other forms that dealt with any fee split. It was just a disclosure. Where in the farm and ranch, it was the ratification of a prior agreement. So it was just taken out across the board from the April meeting. That's my recollection.
And this might have generated too from the farm and ranch working group looking at this. And one member that we have that should be joining us when she's available would be SJ, who might have some more insight into that particular provision. So if at the meeting, let's make a note to circle back around to that, if nothing else, so that way SJ has an opportunity to comment on that one as well.
Yeah, I just think we want to be clear and make sure that we're reminded of why were we going to take that out if we're planning to put something else back in. And then if we're going to put it into 1 to 4 family, we might as well put it back into farm and ranch. But I remember seeing it struck in red and thinking, okay, I don't remember the rationale as to why we were taking it out. And I agree with Christy's point that it does need to be clear to the consumer, because to Brian's point, if there's not clarity, we're not going to closing. So we definitely need the clarity I think that we're trying to figure out the way to balance how to not create liability in the instance where somebody didn't want to sign something because now we're holding it up and now we're not upholding our responsibilities to our consumer, right? And those agency relationships that we have with our consumers. But either way, we still need to specify that this is in a separate written agreement. I think because we've got we've addressed the issue of the buyer's either paying all of it or the seller's paying some of it. So all we have left is this agreement between the brokers, and without doing an agreement between the brokers, I think we're trying to find a workaround for the agreement between brokers is what we're trying to come up with, because that's really all it is. It's the agreement between the brokers to share in compensation. I feel very comfortable that everything else we've done already creates an obligation for the seller, and the buyer has their own obligation. I feel like it's really all about between the brokers, and we got to decide how we're going to move that forward.
That's a great way to center the discussion there. Brian, a quick comment. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Melissa, would you be satisfied if you had something saying the undersigned brokers ratify the payments set out in paragraph B above, but are not otherwise a party to the contract?
Probably so. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And it would still alleviate that potential, liability, but have the clarity. But yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
One thing to keep in mind with language-wise when we get there later is the agreement between brokers does not have to be in writing, unlike the agreements between buyers, sellers, and their brokers. So when if we get to the point of drafting that language here, something to keep in mind. Next up, I have Mary, then Diane, and then Tony.
Well, the word ratification really bothers me. And the reason is I don't want to be a party to the contract, and I don't think agents want to be a party to the contract. And I know I heard Brian, and maybe I misheard him, but he said, if people don't agree with what they're doing, then we don't get to closing. Well, the conversation on compensation should not be in the contract. It's between the buyer and the seller. If there's a statement on the bottom, like we used to have, that such and such will pay we just reword it without taking the word MLS out and just saying in a separate agreement, I don't have a problem with it. But I really have a problem of us signing it and or agreeing to it because we aren't party of the contract. It's the buyer and the seller that are parties of the contract. And we have a form from Texas Realtors, and I agree with Diane, it's probably going to change, and we're probably going to go through some changes, but let's just work out that form now until we get to the point of knowing because we don't know what we don't know right now.
And that's a concern shared by quite a few brokers that wrote in about being parties to the contract, and one thing that it's the core of what we're discussing right now. Next, I have Diane.
Yeah, and just for clarification, I agree that I don't think that the brokers should be a party to the contract. It should be a statement, a disclosure of who is paying what. And yes, we know that it's no longer going to be an offer of compensation, so that wording is going to have to be changed. I am concerned that all of this conversation over funds, which we're talking a lot about adding things, the ratification and signatures that we haven't had before. Is there a need to have that? Or does that just have to be a separate issue between the brokers and their agents to work out and not affect yes, it affects the buyer and the seller because they're usually paying for it. But I'm so fearful that we're going to make changes in the contract that in a couple of months, we're going to have to be talking about changing again. And we know that these aren't going to come up until the beginning of next year. I think we have a need to keep it simple. And again, I think we are kind of premature on knowing how it's really going to work out. As much as I was in favor of the addendum in the beginning, because it was easier to change, that it wasn't in the contract, I think that we are trying to construct something that we don't really know what is needed. We're kind of guessing and basing it on what Texas Realtors developed, which was excellent and is something we're going to be using until we come up with something else. Any Realtor member that is a license holder. But, just listening to our conversation, we don't have a consensus. So are we really ready to do anything other than to make sure that the contracts are usable? And that those members of Texas Realtors do have an addendum to work with. It's not like we're leaving them without anything. And the non-Realtor member would be having a contract like they're used to now. So I'm not hearing consensus among ourselves, and I don't know where that's going to leave us.
And those are good comments there. And I think we'll lead. I see Tony's hand up next. And I think after Tony, if there's one or two more comments, maybe we address that. I think either way, we move the discussion into the actual language of the form to try to get whether we adopt it or suggest it at the end or not. I think it would be helpful to have something in our meeting minutes, whether it's pushed forward or not, for a discussion point going forward. So when we come back to our next meeting, we develop this form, if it's not pushed forward, at least to a point that we may be able to agree upon the language or may not, but at least it's developed a little bit more. And so I'd like to, Tony, and if anybody else has another few comments there. As part of the drafting discussion, I think within that we'll have the intermediary discussion, because the intermediary discussion to me is tied in more to the language than a separate issue, and that concern can be vetted out as we're going through that. And so, Tony, I see you're up next. Lee, I see your hand up after that. And Mary, I think your hand has stayed up, so I see it there, but I'm not skipping over you. I think it just stayed up. There we go.
Hey, John, I'll just make it quick. I was thinking about what Brian said. I don't think you can have any kind of qualifying language because the addendum itself is to a contract. So I don't see how you're going to say, I'm ratifying this, but otherwise I'm not having anything to do with the contract. I mean, the very document you're executing is an addendum to the contract, which is, as we define it, modifying, altering, or adding to an existing agreement. And then you sign it on the end. I think in some way or another, it makes a party. As you said, John, people look at it from different lenses. All I do is real estate litigation with a little bit of farm and ranch brokerage too, but real estate litigation, I got tons of it. And to me, that just begs for a great appeal, because some judges are going to say, yeah, y'all made an agreement. I don't care if you use the word ratify or not. You agreed to something and now you're part of it. I just think that kind of picking up some momentum, but that's all I really want to say. His language was talking about that, and I don't know how you can, if they're signing it and they qualify it. And on the flip note, we've always talked consistently that it's not our business to work out the broker commissions. For example, we wouldn't have a standalone document that just talked about how the brokers are going to share fees. We don't have that. But here we are trying to, we're not really saying it, but we are saying it. We're not really calling an agreement, but we kind of want you to sign your name to it. But it's not our business to actually make a brokerage agreement, but we are going to kind of put one in there. But I think we kind of beat the horse. I was just going to say, from a litigation lens, I see lots of future billables.
Yeah, and what Tony's getting into is that stereotypical slippery slope argument. If once you add them a little bit, but not all the way, lawyers can argue anything and twist anything, and trying to avoid that conundrum at the end and creating more problems where there might not be any right now.
Thank you.
Lee, I see your hand up.
Yeah, while I appreciate what you're saying, John, about, having something in writing in case we want to use it later, I think we're spinning our wheels. I think the whole point is that we're not coming to a consensus. We're talking in circles. We're all saying the same things over and over. I appreciate how much thought and passion everyone has put into it, but I also don't feel like we're getting anywhere. And I think the reason we're not getting anywhere is because we don't know yet. We just don't know. And if we come to some agreement, as we've discussed previously, it would be, best case scenario, January before it got out there for use. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in our markets between now and January. I'm thinking it's going to be, at the risk of throwing TxDOT under the bus, right? By the time they get the freeway finished, it's too narrow, right? I mean, I think that's the circumstance we're in, and I think it makes more sense to wait. We have the luxury of waiting, and I think that we need to do that and watch our markets closely so we can come back with not our speculation, but facts about what's really happening in our marketplaces and then address it head on.
And I think that's a good point to where we're at in this meeting too. I feel very good about the discussion that we've had and up to this point. And I don't want to just say we're going to draft it or we're not going to draft it, but a couple more hands are up. And then maybe and anybody else wants to comment at this point, maybe we have a vote first on whether we continue with revising the addendum so we don't spend a couple hours trying to revise it if it took that long, when at the end we're not going to push anything forward. Regardless of how the vote comes out, I would like to give an opportunity for those to give at least last comment if we don't go forward and draft it, and let you know my vote will be to draft it, but it doesn't, that it's just one vote. But if we don't decide to go forward and drafting it now, at least give everybody, including myself, an opportunity to say what we would potentially like to see in it. And that way that can be considered by the license holders and public and ourselves as we leave this meeting. Right now I see Melissa's hand up first and then Brian's.
So my initial kind of where I'm connecting the dots is this. We have covered all the places that we have the authority to cover as the commission, right? As the real estate commission is the body that we're participating in. And I feel like the only piece that's still missing is this piece that what used to exist was the MLS, and members paid money and participated in the MLS, and that therefore was an agreement between brokers. And those same members are still members of likely Texas Realtors and NAR and their local board, and still have access to agreements between brokers, because that's what's missing is this agreement between the brokers. But if TREC's not in the business of doing agreements between brokers, I feel like, while yes, it would provide clarity, I feel for where Christy's coming from and that the consumer needs the clarity. I think we just can't, maybe it's not an addendum. Maybe it's an optional disclosure form, and it's not an addendum at all, but it's an optional form that people can use if they want to, that says, here's where the money's coming from and going to. But I really got to think we have to find a way to separate ourselves from this agreement between the brokers, because of like what Tony was saying a second ago, it's like we're trying to, well, we're not going to do it, but we're kind of going to do it. We're going to cram it in somehow. And I don't feel like I think it belongs to the members that are paying to have that, or folks that aren't members who want to hire their attorney to write up their own forms. Awesome. Great. Let's do it. Because I think that was what Tony said a minute ago is, I was doing a deal and I called one guy and said, I have a form. And he said, no, I got a form. And okay, great. Figure out which form you guys want to use. But everybody just has their own. And I'm not sold on the fact that we need to create something to explain that to the consumer yet.
One overriding thing before I tee this off to Brian is the ethical rules that we have in place, and the fiduciary duty to our clients not only includes the duty to, be open, honest, and disclose all facts to our client, but also to be fair to the other side and to treat all parties fairly and impartially. And so there's a duty in place that already would require the proper disclosure of the amounts that are being paid by one listing broker to the others, which necessarily impacts the parties. And there's an enforcement, I believe, an enforcement mechanism in place if some falsehood is made that then impacts the deal. And so maybe that's a backstop to if we don't do anything, there's procedures there if it does become a problem in the short term that, complaints can be made to TREC and should be made, in fact, if commissions are misrepresented or reneged on at the end, or however you might want to state it. So that's a consideration we can have in our minds as well. Brian?
I want to make it clear, and this is to Tony and Lee and Mary especially, I have not changed my mind in this phone call. However, I sense that we don't have an agreement here. The things aren't going to sync because we do or do not add an addendum. And we have some really good changes in the contract forms that we need to move forward with. Okay.
Yes.
And as silver tongued as I think I am, I have not convinced people of my position, and give me some time, I will. But right now TXR does have a form that will achieve the purpose, and it can be utilized by 85% plus of the brokers and agents out there in the community. Let's not go for the perfect and throw away the okay stuff, and we got okay stuff. So I'm gonna say let's table the addendum. Let's keep working on it at our next meeting, but let's move forward and get the good changes done that we have, including the additions to paragraph 12.
I second that motion.
And I'm not sure we need to even call a vote after what I think is on my side. I think maybe I'm not going to speak for anybody else. Actually, I'll speak for myself. I'm seeing the writing, on the wall here with the committee, and I think we've done justice to this issue, and this highlights how we can agree to disagree on things and push things forward still. And so I know I would like to see if anybody feels the other way to make an argument and see if you want to call an official vote. But it looks like to me that the consensus is coming around to let's let it play out a little bit more and run with this paragraph 12 language that we have, which is a huge improvement. I didn't hear one comment against that when we started this meeting, and I haven't heard any in the community other than Ron has some items he heard from mortgage lenders that I think we should address after dealing with this addendum. And then I think before we get off this meeting, assuming we agree just to move past the addendum for now, is to make sure what we have in our contracts now doesn't need to be changed back from what we did at the last meeting. The last meeting concluded pretty quickly, so I'd just like to go back and make sure, like that ratification in the farm and ranch and the disclosure in the 1 to 4 and the other contracts are either in there or not in there, so we have a firm understanding of what we're sending up to the commission. But would anybody else like to comment or feel strongly against just moving forward now past the addendum to discuss those other issues? Okay, so we'll move past that. I don't think we need an official vote. And Christy, I've shared your heart on a lot of these issues, and we can work together as a whole committee, or the subcommittee can continue to work in between the next meeting, the next meeting, to come up with more solutions as they develop in the market. Ron, for the language that we actually have developed, would you like to voice the concerns that you received from the lenders in terms of the 12A or the paragraph 12 language?
Right. I can, let's see here. Let me pull up as we're talking. I need to stop sharing and then pull up maybe pull up the meeting materials real quick, so that if we're going to be talking about that language and the other language, as you mentioned, we can kind of follow along real quickly. Let's see if I've got those up. Okay, so I can go to the paragraph 12 language that was discussed in this is anecdotal with regard to different mortgage lenders, but the question came up is having two blanks here in paragraph 12, how does the mortgage industry look at that? And do they think that's a good idea or not such a great idea? So it was kind of split. There was some indication that it was fine, that it didn't seem to be a big issue. The other was that this needed to be broken out into a separate paragraph C, so that it was clear that it was not part of the same concession amount. And then the last was that we shouldn't have it at all, period, because this person, I think, though, was looking at the addendum also, because the addendum itself would address the payment of fees, and so you didn't need it. In other words, if you were asking for a concession, it would kind of go back to like our version 1. You would actually have that in a separate addendum as opposed to here. But based on that our conversation today, I'm not sure that last sort of thought really applies if we're not going to be pushing out any type of addendum. So I think that was the concern here. And then I know that Chelsea raised the question about whether we should actually have a percentage amount here as well. We've never had a percentage amount in the one that's existing there for the payment of buyer's expenses generally. And I don't know if that's, I'm assuming the industry handled that fairly well, but I don't know with regard to how that works or how the industry would look at that with regard to a new concession for specifically set aside for the brokerage fees. So that's all I heard.
And I believe from everybody on the committee was comfortable with this language as is. Those concerns there, I think we've talked about either at the last meeting or the new concern being mitigated by not having the addendum. So I don't believe we need to make any move forward or discuss any additional changes to this, but I would see several hands up here. So we'll go first Diane, then Lee, Melissa, then Brian.
I too ran it by a couple of lenders. They were a little concerned about the blending of the two in one sentence. I think we had talked about there originally being consideration of there being a C. The lenders that I spoke with thought that that was a better idea, and there may also be an issue with the lawsuit provisions regarding the Department of Justice's wanting to separate out compensation. So I think with those thoughts in mind, if we're going to be affecting the contracts, we might want to make a C just to be on the safe side and make it two separate lines of consideration.
Okay. Lee?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I started thinking about this between meetings. You know, when we changed the paragraph with earnest money and option fee, and that's kind of in one sentence, we see time and again that the option fee is getting put in the earnest money blank and vice versa. It's because it's all in one line, it's getting confused. So I think, and yes, I know training, we're working on it, I know. But if, you know, starting out here, I think going with a C and making it two separate sentences is very prudent. And then the other thing I would say is I do think we need to, if we haven't already, we need to revise the addendum so that it matches the language in 12. So if we do, you know, if we make an amendment, it's very easy on the addendum to address 12 at the same time.
Good point.
Those are my comments.
In the addendum, are you saying the amendment?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. The amendment to the contract. Yes, my apologies.
Okay. So there is some more concern being raised about splitting it out. We'll continue. Melissa, you're up next.
I think we even talked about this at the last meeting, and I remember thinking we should definitely split this out. And I think if we were going to consider adding a percentage, if it was split and we had 12A1B and 12A1C, whichever one of those two works towards potentially going to the brokerage fees that the buyers agreed to pay, I would, first of all, I would make that C, right? Because we've been using 12A1B forever for the other expenses. I think 12A1C would be appropriate to be broker fees applied to brokers fees that the buyers agreed to pay. And I think it would totally work to say dollar amount or percentage, because the agents are going to be used to seeing dollar amount or percentage. That's going to be something where they're going to go, oh, this is for the broker fee. This C, letter C is for the broker fee. And Lee, we did fix the amendment at the last meeting, but if we make a change here, we need to make another change. So, but I 100% agree. I would love to see it 12A1C personally.
That's an interesting thought on the percentage making more sense or fit in better if it was a separate provision on that. Brian?
Yeah, an easy fix might be to keep it all in B, but say seller shall also pay, next line I, an amount not to exceed to be paid for brokerage fees, and then I, an amount not to exceed to be applied to other buyer expenses. So they're all in the B paragraph, but you break it up into separate lines like we did recently with respect to survey coverage. If you recall, we didn't change the language at all. We just had we just separated them visually into two separate lines, made it more clear, and we could put some boxes in front as to whether they apply or not.
And that's an interesting concept. And I'm hearing enough now, maybe we need to start working on the language. We'll go 2 more hands and then see if we want to start playing with that language, whether it's B and C or subparagraphs. You're convincing me and changing my mind. Lee, you're up next, and then Diane.
Yeah, Brian, I would like to understand, I mean, it is new to the contract, right? It's not some, right? So I don't, what is the reasoning for keeping it under B as opposed to making it C? I mean, I don't know that I have a strong opinion. I really want you to tell me why.
12A1B is the paragraph where we talk about what the seller will pay. That's it. And so we're keeping it all in 12A1B. Oh, and by the way, John, I also agree that we should put the percentage in there because commissions will change based upon the amount of the sales price. And so I think it'd probably be best to have the 2 options, either a flat dollar amount or the percentage. But to answer your question, Lee, I think I'd like to keep it all in 12A1B. And we also, in the structure of this, we said X dollars to be paid to brokerage fees that buyers agreed to pay, an amount not to exceed blank dollars to be applied to other buyer expenses. So I think the two phrases go together, one for commission and then the other blank is for anything else. That's why I sort of feel like it's good to keep them together.
Okay. Well, John, I'll say I still like C better, but not a sword I'm going to fall on. Like whatever y'all decide, I'm good.
We'll see what it looks like as we start drafting it here. I have Diane next, and then Melissa has her hand up. And maybe, Ron, if you want to be prepared to have a Word document open to start playing with this language here. Diane?
Yeah, we talk about how important education is for the agents and familiarity with consumer. If we keep 12A1B, what the agents are used to and the purpose of it, and add a C referencing the compensation, it is going to set it out as something new and something added and not confuse them. So I'm strongly in favor of a C.
Okay. Melissa?
Same. I mean, I'm with Lee. I wouldn't die on this sword, but I strongly would recommend that we do it as a C. And I think it still works because 12A1 says expenses payable by the seller. And then we have all kinds of things. We just don't fill in anything under A, but those are still things seller has to pay. I think B needs to be to the other expenses though, which is going to be wonky. So I guess we wouldn't be able to do it that way. Because other expenses seems like the end of everything. So that would be a training issue, right? Because 12A1B, we think of immediately like, oh, this is repairs or, whatever, because it's going towards these other expenses. But I really feel like 12A1C would be new, it'd be different, it'd stick out, and it would be, oh, and we've got a dollar amount and a percentage. This is brokers. I think brokerage fees being separated is super important.
And Brian, I was following what you said in the concern. I looking at it a different way that just popped in my mind to throw on the table for discussion is that seller shall also pay is duplicative, right? We already have one that says seller expenses payable by seller, and then it breaks it down. And so the same concern that you raised in making a C almost already applies to the existing language because it's an expense that's broken down to be paid by the seller already. And we're just saying they also should pay this. So we may consider removing the beginning part of B in the language that we look at drafting to make it consistent and not have the issue I think that popped into your head, which I immediately agreed with, but I maybe that other way can address it. Let's see.
Yeah,
Well, I'm not sure
and I'd
your
also
hand up,
say,
Susan.
we could also just say B would be an amount not to exceed blank dollars to be applied to buyer expenses other than broker fees.
Yeah, let me share here real quick.
And then C would be broker's fees.
Yeah, so
I'd love to see not so much emphasis on broker fees.
Ron,
by
if you're pulling
making
that up, I want to give
predominant.
Amy a chance to get her comment in real quick. And Mary, I see your hand up as well. But
Yeah.
Amy, if you want to jump in.
I think what I was going to say is I think everybody will be able to absorb it better when Ron has it up on the screen. I think the only issue you're going to run into, I know that the broker members that have commented, really like the idea of having the C cover the compensation. But I think you're going to have if you keep the regular expenses that are the regular concessions as B, or whether it's B or BI, little I, you're still going to have to say other than. I mean, the flow of it is, the reason why the flow of it is the way it is now is because you can have the catch-all as the other be the last thing. So we're going to pay this, then we're going to pay this, and then this amount of anything else. So it makes it flow better. Personally, I think it flows better. I think this paragraph is going to be different either way. I don't think it's going to matter whether it's a little c or it's a NB or it's a B1 and 2. I think having it up here so that Ron can kind of play around with it will help us visualize it better.
Yeah.
I think we're focused too much on it's going to flow, because if you don't have it, if you have C be the compensation, you're going to have B be more convoluted because you're going to have to exclude the compensation, and I just think it's going to flow better if you have the last one be other, if that makes sense. So
It does.
Yeah.
And Ron, if you don't mind including, so we have it on the screen, the beginning part of paragraph 12, because there's that lead-in sentence before we get to B that I would like us to keep in mind as we're drafting this.
Okay.
Both
Correct.
in the beginning. Let's see. Pull up that language.
Grab it here.
And Mary, as he's grabbing that, see your hand up if you wanted to provide your comment.
Again, I'm going to go back to that workaround, and I know they're going to be watching, and I just know agents in C will put what they think the full compensation is. And I'm really concerned about that. I'm really, really concerned about that. I like what Brian said.
And I think the workaround's a little limited in terms of my concern with regard to the specific issues raised in the lawsuit, because it's something that is clearly disclosed that the seller will actually be paying, as opposed to an amount that the listing broker charged previously to a seller, and then make some other agreement not involving the parties. This has to be authorized to the other side. This to me is spelled out very clear, and the seller has the opportunity to reject it and to say, no, I don't want to pay 3%. I don't think that should be in there. And we have the new rules from at least the realtor members that they can't charge an additional amount over and beyond what's already in the written agreement that the buyer has agreed to pay. So we have some limitations on the realtor members there, but there will be, I think that concern is never completely mitigated. And so I do see it in my mind, it's a little more, less of a concern if we have it here, but it is a concern still. I think you raised your hand again. Go ahead.
I'm just concerned that, we'll do all this work and they're going to shut it down. I mean, they have in California, and the DOJ's watching. That's why I like what Brian said, that it will be applied and we can do that on the outside rather than identifying that. But I'm only one of 13, so you guys can go with what you want, but I just think it's going to be an issue because they're watching. It's not like, and I know we're not in the lawsuit, but the DOJ just doesn't like realtors or real estate agents or whatever you want to call us at this point in time. They're looking. So
we'll do our best to make sure we don't provide any fuel for that fire, at the same time addressing the concerns that we need to address in our statutory directive here. And we might, all these things, that brings us around, as Ron is typing here, all these things we're doing our best on, and we may need to revise them in the future, and it may change at our next meeting. We're hoping these are lasting changes, especially now that we're doing incrementally and not doing the addendum and or adding additional commission language in the contract besides the concession. So I think we're taking a good incremental step here.
What do the commissioners think that are on here? I would love their opinion because it's going to them for approval anyway. I would love their thoughts.
Can I say one statement there real quick? And I don't want to overstep a commissioner's right to make any statement here as a member watching this, but it kind of takes away, if we ask them their opinion right now, it takes away their ability to deliberate as a group and collegial group. So I don't know. I just want to put that out there. I don't know if it's really appropriate to ask. They can always chime in and tell us what they think.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I would put anybody on the spot like that, and similar to our first meeting on this, of having everybody express their opinions without locking them in if they so want it, but they're welcome anytime to provide their feedback. So Ron is on the screen drafting a few alternatives, whether it's the A with B and 2 little i's, or just A with A, B, and C.
Right. Now we can switch B and C if we want to. We'll just have to play with the language a little bit. The reason why this was easy draft is because we had said we just made it easy to say to other buyer expenses. So it's really just an indentation issue when you look at it in the greater context.
Hey, Ron, I think in B and C, you can take out the phrase seller shall also pay.
Well,
one starts with expenses payable by seller.
Right, but it's not a sentence. This is more of a title under 1.
Well, A.
Well, I guess your A says
That's what A does.
It's kind of weirdly drafted in terms of a sentence, right? The following expenses must be paid at or prior to closing. That's passive. And then we sort of title it expenses payable by seller's expenses. But I guess you could do that. I see what you're saying. You want to just take this out and just do it like this?
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
And if you wanted in 1, you could say seller shall pay the following expenses. A1.
I don't know how the other brokers feel, but it made it clear, looking for the consumer as well as the agent without having to look back up and say, who are they talking about? It was clear. I kind of liked it the way it was. I don't know how other
broker members feel.
So you're saying A1, Brian, expenses, you maybe
And
change
just
the
say-
seller shall pay?
Yeah, seller shall pay the following expenses.
Okay, we'd have to do the same to match
To-
that buyer.
Yeah, I don't, of course, I don't like that.
Why? It's all right.
Expenses.
It works the same way.
Hmm.
We just simply buyer shall pay the following expenses, buyer expenses. I think it's a little getting away from the active. I mean, going to the active, but that's all right. I'm okay either way.
Okay, so let's see. Give everybody a minute here to look over these two versions. To let you know, A1A currently in the contract is 1, 2, 3 lines. So we have releases of existing liens, ... That subparagraph takes up 3 lines. So B will be starting a couple lines below where it is right now. In looking at this, my initial comment is we're repetitive in the first version that does the little I's now that we've changed the intro. We have seller shall pay, and then B starts with seller shall pay, where the ABC has the common start of seller shall pay, then it's ABC without being repetitive.
Yep, that makes sense. I see what you're saying. What do you think, Brian?
I like the second has fewer words.
Can we add the percentage language into the A1B in that second version? Or you can go in both versions. Brokers, let me ask this, and Lee, I see your hand up first. The percentage, from what I'm hearing, is most of the time going to be used. So do we want to start with the percentage instead of the dollar amount, or elsewhere, like in the farm and ranch, we start with the dollar amount, then percentage. But I rate that, and Lee,
That out because
you have the floor.
Yeah, I think it should be dollar first. Let's be consistent. But I'm looking at paragraph 12, and I want to, if we change this language, where we say seller shall pay the following, what we're doing here, we've also got to look at 12A2 and change to the buyer's expenses where we say buyer shall pay.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. Let me ask one quick question on this. Do you want to add, I took this out here,
No,
or you just
I
want to put,
don't. I don't want to do that.
that's in the existing form.
That's what we have now.
And I don't know if you want that same language here or not. It just leaves an open for a lesser amount, but I don't know.
I mean, that would be a significant change to delete that not to exceed language, because you do have situations where the
Okay, yeah, if
fees
it's
the
already
buyer
there, leave
has.
it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, and remember, we also took out the language that as allowed by the lender. I forget the exact language, but we had crossed that out in the red line version that was on the screen before. And so
Okay.
we're revisiting this. That's something to consider because if the lender doesn't allow those expenses, and I'm trying to remember the discussion on this, but the lender doesn't allow it, is this language enough to give notice to the buyer where they're not upset at the end and haven't factored that in absolutely to be part of their finances on the deal?
Right.
John, we said the lenders, that the problem with allowables is not something we've run into in many, many years. And so that's why we agreed to take it out now. And I think Diane had something.
Oh, I see. Thank you for pointing that out. Diane?
Yeah, I think the Brian's very right. I think we'd all agree that we need to keep the wording as it is regarding amount not to exceed to be applied to the buyer's expenses. I don't know that having it there attached to the brokerage fees would be appropriate, in that there would be agreements between buyers and their agent and sellers and their agent in writing. So why would we invite it to be anything less than what's stated in a separate agreement? I think we're getting into the proprietary agreement between the brokers and their clients. What's the rationale for putting an amount not to exceed regarding the broker fees?
So one thing that comes to mind is, let's say the buyer's agent most of the time will be drafting these documents in conjunction with the buyer. But let's say their fee agreement limits them to X amount and they're a member of TXR. Then it wouldn't be an absolute amount, because it would be capped at whatever that fee arrangement is, assuming it's not later amended to match this or amended prior to the contract.
And that's
would
my
be,
point.
if I'm
It
coming up with
can
an
be
argument to
amended.
keep it in, but
They do have the ability to amend those agreements. I'm just wondering if we're opening an area that we need not to be a party to.
and if anybody has thoughts on that, as I'm processing that as you stated it, but if anybody has a comment, feel free to jump in.
I think Diane's right. I don't think we need to put that with the broker compensation. I think the seller is limiting what they're paying by whatever they put in the blank.
I think it's more confusing. I think it's going to be more confusing to people.
If you add
by having that language in there. Okay.
Correct. By having an amount not to exceed. I think you just leave it at a dollar amount or a percentage of the sales price, but leave C the way it is. But I think on the commission, I think it's better to not have it.
Agree.
What am I doing here?
I agree with that as well. And the concern that I had in the back of my head that I was trying to work through is, what if the underlying contracts don't allow it? But that goes back to, well, you have to be fair and impartial to everybody, including the other side as an agent. So they need to make sure this is right. And if it's not allowed by the contracts, there's an enforcement mechanism for to handle those issues.
Ron, can you put some boxes in there?
Oh, you mean here? Yeah, right up here. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, hey, so I just learned something. If I put a Q and switch it to wingdings, I get a box.
Got it.
Oh
I've been
man,
using developer all this time.
life changing.
Secrets, Ron.
I had that exact same thought, Brian. That is going to save a lot of time and heartache.
It's because usually when I do the switching the font size, it all goes to Q. So I knew that.
This is what happens when you've typed in as many boxes as Ron has.
I think inside the box, that's all I worry about.
So the checkbox, why the checkbox here? Right now we don't have checkboxes on any of these amounts, right? And so it was a blank that presumably is either left blank or somebody wrote in NA in most cases. And so what would be the reasoning venture away from that here.
Because
Well, you could, if you wanted to put some sort of instruction, you could put a parenthetical without the check boxes right here and to say complete only one.
I think it's
Yeah.
easier to do the
That-
check boxes, and you have them because it says or.
Well, my concern is if the seller hasn't agreed to pay any amount towards them, this is almost an argument can be made. This is pushing the seller to offer something, or most of the time, I think in our contracts we say check one or check all applicable boxes, which suggest action as opposed to a blank that may or may not be used within the contract. So I just raised that. I haven't processed it, but I just raised that issue. I definitely don't think we should have an instruction to check only one, or unless we have a none box as well.
Yeah, if you wanted to make it clear, you could check this box and put 0 that you're actually stating 0, or you just leave it blank.
and you create an ambiguity if one line is blank dollars and the other is 3%.
Right.
And I do see now that's in the farm and ranch language at the end of the contract for the agreement for buyer or seller to pay the broker fees has those check boxes. So that helps with my concern that it will not be used properly, or suggests that it has to be paid.
Right. So the other alternative here, I'm not going to put this in here, but another kind of formatting way that we do the same thing here is you flip this over and put it at the end. And say, oh, well, that's not going to work.
Oops.
If you wanted to do that, and then you would have check one box only, if you like that formatting, as compared to this one up here.
Tee this up, especially to the brokers. After you have a second to digest this, I would love your comments on what you think with the practice would be the most understandable.
Does anybody care?
Well, you got to read it a few times to know what you're supposed to do with it. So that's not simple. Where would this be fall?
This would be right here. In lieu of this right here, we put this one down here. That's just a different formatting. So if you don't like the way that this one looks, this is another formatting approach to accomplish the same thing.
I think I like the first one better.
Me too.
I do appreciate the effort though, Ron.
Sure.
Options are always good.
Although, I mean, I agree. Keep in mind, though, the second option, it has the word brokerage fee in the sentence before you fill in the blank.
It's also going to be what they're used to seeing, at least those that use the farm and ranch contract. So I don't know.
Which one would be? The new one?
Yeah, the new one. By saying the amount to be applied to brokerage fees, it brings to your, okay, this is talking about brokerage fees first, and then you have the dollar amounts.
That's a good point.
So I don't know. I actually think I like the second one better, but John asked the broker, so I might not get a vote on that.
Well, you
See
kind
how
of
many
changed my
pitchforks are going to
mind.
come out before the lawyers chime in.
Yeah,
Well,
I
I'm
think
teed up
I'm
for
kind of
anybody at
coming
this
over
point.
to that.
What is Christy still on? Does she have a preference?
Let's see.
She may have needed to leave.
I don't see her.
I believe so. I believe, and this, for everybody, this was a meeting that we tried to cram in very quickly, and certain members couldn't be here at the beginning, and certain members had to drop off at the end. So everybody did their best to be here today. The second option to me seems, I'm not sure softer is the word, but it almost gives my mind a little more time to process what the provision means. And of course, that's a short-term issue, not a long-term once people start using this or license holders and the consumers start using it. But I don't have a very strong opinion.
Well,
either
if
way.
I had a vote, I would opt for this one only because I don't like starting sentences with boxes.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is better.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay,
Thank you as always, Ron.
sure. We'll stick that there. And that should be, if I can get this over there correctly. Nope.
Folks, I'm gonna have to sign off too, but I really appreciate y'all and everything you've done and staying late and the new meeting and everything.
Now that you leave, Lee, we're going to go back and adopt the addendum.
And I will hunt you down. Thank you.
We may lose a quorum.
Yeah, that's what we're. Yeah, and I'm going to need to be leaving fairly soon too. I hope we can come
we have
to.
a lawful quorum? Can we get a vote real quickly
Yeah.
on these changes and recommending them to be sent to the commission for adoption, along with a conforming amendment to paragraph 12A2?
And also the amendment, right?
Are you eliminating that first
Oh, here
option,
it is.
Ron?
I'm sorry. So yeah, so this would be, yeah, we need to eliminate this. What we need to also do is to, well, probably the simple thing to do is to adopt this form, what we just drafted here in our drafts.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I move.
Okay.
Second.
To make conforming changes.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
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 All
The
against,
second-
say no. All right.
Good work.
Second vote we need real quick is, do you want to make conforming changes in the amendment?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then, we probably need one vote now to say, for the committee is recommending that we submit these forms to the commission for publication at their next meeting
August commission meeting.
before we lose a quorum.
Yes.
I
So
will
moved.
make that
I
motion.
second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 All against, say no. Motion passes.
Is there any other things that you can think of we need real
You
quickly?
need to approve minutes.
The
No.
two that I just want to throw out, if we need to look at real quickly, are did we take the disclosure out at the end of the contract or leave that in the 1 to 4? And the ratification, I think we didn't discuss that all the way, but at last meeting we took that out of the farm and ranch. Because we're not doing the addendum, does that need to stay in now? And revisit that when we visit the addendum and the compensation language in the future.
That two
My concern is
questions.
taking that out Yeah, so there's two separate questions. So I guess first starting with the ratification we know has been taken out of the Farm and Ranch in the current draft. I would put it back in because we haven't made any other changes. I agree with Ryan on that.
Yes.
You know why we
have the
took it
motion
out?
to.
The reason why we took it out, John, was I'm just now recollecting is that it was part of the things to take out with references to MLS, since there was a prior agreement. But since it doesn't specifically reference MLS, I guess that's okay. But I think that's the reason why it came out.
And I think in this case, since we're not having a separate procedure or compensation amendments, I don't see a big need to change the Farm and Ranch practice right now. And I know a lot of Farm and Ranch agents use that ratification of fee. So I would suggest and entertain a motion to leave that one back in.
I move to replace the ratification fee in the Farm and Ranch, leave it unchanged.
Okay.
Agree.
Second.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 All against, say no. Okay, that motion passes. And the last one I have that I want to get to make sure before we leave is the disclosure language at the end of all the other contracts. I don't know if that was actually removed. I know we at least had the change removing MLS, but I'm not sure if we had the entire disclosure removed.
It is removed in these versions. Yeah, the whole paragraph.
I think all we really need to take out is the parenthetical, right? Such as.
Well, yeah, probably so. Because you have the new TAR form, right? That's using for that purpose. And you might have other similar forms like that. Okay. So do you want to leave?
Yeah, on that one, I would suggest that we also, because we're not, again, doing the next step in the process, I don't see a big benefit to taking that out. And it provides disclosure of what that amount is, just like it was in the past. I don't see a big need to take that out right now. And I wouldn't want to rush to take that out to create more confusion than is necessary with these other changes.
But we do need to amend the wording because there is no offer of compensation in the MLS after August 17th.
Correct.
Right.
You could delete the whole parenthetical, I think.
Right.
I agree with that.
So how would it read?
Pursuant to a previous separate agreement, comma, listing broker has agreed to pay.
Other broker fee,
right,
and then another parentheses.
And then we keep the disclosures for informational purposes and does not change the previous agreement between brokers.
Yeah, you keep everything except for the parenthetical, such as an MLS offer of compensation or other agreement between brokers.
I would suggest striking the words or share a commission.
Oh, yes.
Is that all right?
Yeah, the other broker fee. Yes, I agree. So everything after between brokers?
Right.
So if a listing broker is getting 5% and they're going to pay 2.5%, is that paying 2.5% or is that sharing?
Well, it doesn't matter.
Well, it may, from a tax
I believe
standpoint.
the form that we have as compensation between brokers is what we are being encouraged to give to the other broker to disclose what the buyer, a seller or listing broker is offering would be what we would be using. What was your question again?
Yeah. So I think that in answering Brian's question, I'm not really, to me, it's a repetitive frame, and I don't like the term sharing a commission between brokers who are not part of the same brokerage firm. So I
Yeah,
think
and
we just,
commission sharing are just words we're not supposed to be using right now.
but you can leave it. I don't think it matters, Brian, legally. Just I think it's unnecessary.
Well, is that DOJ's hot button?
Yes.
I wish I knew.
Yes.
Do
Yes,
we
it
achieve
is.
the same? Do we
At least
achieve the
that's what we're
same
being
purpose
told.
by saying pay?
I think we do.
Or is it a distinction without a difference?
That's what I think.
At the end, it's a distinction without a difference to me.
I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but what I'm constantly hearing in many of the NAR supported webinars is that the issue that the DOJ has is compensation sharing between brokers. They want it separated. Ultimately, that the listing agent will be paid by the seller and the buyer's agent will be paid by the buyer, and there will be no more sharing as we move forward. So now might be the time to eliminate that word just in case that is the case.
I agree. Take it out.
Here's actually, do you see it on the screen there? Is that okay to go with that language there?
I don't think you need the comma after previous. That works. I mean, it's a disclosure and it says it's for informational purpose. So it has no meaning anyway.
Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting taking this out?
No, I'm saying, well, I'd go back to what we agreed 2 years ago to take the whole darn thing out, but we got a lot of opposition from the community. So I think this works just fine.
Okay.
I like the language in there because this is one that affects a deal point for the buyer. If they need to know and have some confidence what the listing broker is paying their broker, which will impact the amount the buyer then pays their agent under the contract that most license holders will be using. Right. So if they use the Texas Realtors buyer representation form and most other forms I've seen have a credit for that amount. So I think it's important to have that, at least that disclosure in the contract.
And I would agree with that. There's been always a question mark about what's supposed to be in that paragraph, that parenthetical line. Is there a reason why we would not put a dollar or percentage in, or is there a rationale of why it's just a blank? It used to be a percentage of sales price, a blank of sales price, and then it was changed.
Well, I think if the brokers are okay with it now, I would leave it the way it is because we're not changing anything.
I see Diane's point though, because what other option would it be other than a fee or a dollar amount? And it would be consistent with the other ways we reference it in the contract and also in the farm and ranch. Well, I take that back. As I'm reading this, ratification fee just has a blank in it. Everywhere else has a dollar or the percentage. That's not it's in Lee's words, not a sword I'm willing to die on. So I'm okay either way, but I do see Diane's point.
Well, if we do look at the farm and ranch at the bottom, there is a dollar amount and a percentage of total sales price. So we have a rationale in that is what is there, and it used to be, and it was changed before I was on the committee, so I don't know the reason why, but it would be a lot easier for the brokers because they have a tendency of putting in a percentage and not of anything. 2% of what? It doesn't say of sales price, so they have to add those words. And if there is a flat fee, then a dollar amount with a blank or a box with a percentage of total sales price would make it a whole lot clearer.
That's a very good point on what the percent is. I agree that most I see here just put a percentage in without it being tied to the sales price. From a clarity standpoint, that makes sense to me, as a reason to make that change. Does anybody else have thoughts on that? I know we have to move this forward so we can keep our quorum, but either way.
I don't have a problem either way. I just I'm a little worried about changing that at this point in time, since it's blank and pulls away from any kind of standard practice. But if the brokers want to put it in there, I don't have an issue with it. I do think that since it's a parenthetical, it's almost irrelevant to the statement, and it's a disclosure. So you're still going to need a CDA from as far as getting over to the title company to pay the right amount anyway, regardless if you leave that blank or put something in there.
That is true, but I will say it has been an area of confusion ever since the change was made. So I would like to move that we be consistent and follow what we have in the farm and ranch contract and put a dollar amount, a box and a dollar amount, or a box and a percentage of total sales price.
And I'm with Diane on that. It could be copied and pasted from the language we have right where your cursor is. But does anybody else want to jump in on that? I mean, if we're making a change now, and this likely will stay in, I think that'd be a good change to make for clarity. I think everybody else just is ready to get this wrapped up, but I don't have a strong feeling either way. So I say strong feeling. I'm on Diane's side, but I'm not getting a strong feeling from anybody else.
I like it the way it was written first without that, but.
Okay. So 2-2, whether we have anybody else would like to jump in?
John, I'll weigh in. I think that the dollar amount or percentage is good the way Ron has it right now. I think it's clearer. It matches what we're adding in 12. And it might make them feel better, like they feel like they have a place to put that, since this is the whole reason why we've been down this rabbit hole to begin with.
It makes it less likely they'll screw up.
Amen.
I'll just add, I have a vague recollection of why this was done this way. And I think prior, I was looking at the past version. Previously, the contract just had a blank and it said of total sales price. And I seem to recall there was some discussion about other types of compensation that could be offered beyond just a percentage. So it could be like a bonus being offered, which is, I think, why the committee at the time elected to go against something like this, to just provide the greatest amount of flexibility as to what could be the compensation between the brokers. For what that's
we add an and or in between the two boxes to take care of the issue of a bonus plus a commission amount, a percentage amount.
Could that be inviting a request for funds on top of the percentage?
Well, it should be used for that purpose to begin with, but it's part of the discussion.
I'll send you some cases. I have a very strong aversion against and/or.
Okay. And yes, and that may be a 5% rule on that, but I do like this language in the check boxes. It, I think, provides clarity there.
And since it's in a parenthetical, I suspect Vanessa might opine that it's not a material change if you decide to go back to the blank.
Yeah, I think if this is something we talked about, if you decide to go back to what it is currently, then I think our position has typically been that's not a substantive change that would require reproposal.
And for everybody's benefit, that means if after this meeting, the commission makes a suggestion or public comment comes in that makes a suggestion, we can change it without having to go through the process from the beginning again. So this is one change that in the future could be made and continue on the same timeline that we're trying to accomplish right now. So do I have a motion to make the change as drafted by Ron on the screen to the 5 contracts, all except the farm and ranch, to the disclosure on page 10?
So move.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor say aye.
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 All against say no. All right, motion passes. I appreciate everybody making time for this meeting. I know the last meeting was long. This meeting we had scheduled 2 hours, and I'm actually quite surprised we kept it under 3. And I think I'll just invite at the end, if you need to leave, feel free to leave at this point, unless we need any further action, Ron, that we need to take before we
were
release our
going
quorum.
to reserve some time to do our normal practice of approving minutes, but I don't think that's required under law to approve the minutes. So I think we're okay by deferring those to the next meeting.
And I just to be clear, have we passed a motion, the whole package goes to the commission?
Yes, we did that.
Okay.
We did.
We did
At the last
earlier,
meeting, we
before this.
passed that, and
Okay.
and this is modifying what we already passed up
Okay.
to be included in those forms. And so again, I appreciate everybody's time and effort on this. I will, if you need to leave, feel free to hop off. I do want to give those that are remaining today a brief chance to make any final comments on this ongoing discussion. For those in the public that are watching, this doesn't end today. We're always watching every part of these contracts, and this is one of the issues that are on front of everybody's mind right now. So no, we're always looking at this. I don't have any further comment myself, except to say how much I appreciate everybody's effort on this in earnestly working on this. This is by far the best membership that I've in my 7 or 8 years on this committee, on the work that everybody's put in and how much everybody cares. So that is much appreciated, and especially for the staff and the commissioners, and involvement in this has been tremendous, and everybody's working hard for you all out there, and the consumers and the license holders. So keep those comments coming in, and I can't tell you how much I personally appreciate everybody's efforts on this.
Good job, John. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, everybody. Good meeting.
All right. Well, if nobody else has any comments, again, I appreciate it all. We'll hopefully you'll attend the upcoming commission meeting as well, and you can hear their discussion on these forums. And until our next meeting, hope everybody stays safe. Have a good time.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.